So today we are up to part 7 in our series about Disney legend Mary Blair, the person who many believe was Walt's favorite artist. When we left off last time, Mary Blair had been rehired by Walt to go on the South American goodwill trip. This happened while picket lines were still moving across both of the gates at the Disney studio, and shortly later she found herself with a group of highly skilled artists taking a series of flights over many days that eventually brought her to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This trip would begin a multi-year connection between the Disney studio and the American war effort. And that is exactly where we pick up our story today. For the Disney artist moving through Latin America, the trip was planned with 3 separate legs of travel. The first would be spent in Rio, the second in Buenos Aires, and for the third, small subgroups traveling independently would explore different sections of South and Central America as well as Mexico. The countries of Brazil and Argentina, and to a lesser extent Chile, were considered the most important objectives for the CIAA due to rising Nazi influence through newspapers, radio, and film presentations in those countries. Brazil at this time had not yet formally joined the Allies, and Nazi agents were allowed to operate freely in Argentina, sending radio communications back to Germany. The political goal of the Disney CIAA effort in Rio was to establish strong feelings of political and economic connection between the two countries, enticing citizens there away from German influence to create hemispheric unity against the Nazis. This might be partially achieved through Disney cartoons that showed famous characters typically considered to be residents of the U.S., such as Donald Duck, enjoying South American locations and making friends there. The ostensible reason for the trip, Lee Blair explained, was to collect music and story ideas, and we did set up a little studio in Rio. There we spent our days collecting material and drawing pictures down at the botanical gardens of the tropical foliage. These paintings and sketches would be sent back to Burbank, where months later, Disney artists would use them as inspiration for 6 and 7-minute cartoons. One of the primary goals was to develop South American animated characters that would authentically represent individual countries and also blend seamlessly into the artistic style of a Disney cartoon. Donald Duck, for example, would need friends in South America to humorously demonstrate this cultural camaraderie on screen. For Brazil, artists believed that a parrot or a papagaio, which is Portuguese for parrot, might represent Rio, as parrots repeatedly showed up in regional folktales. At an exhibition of cartoon art arranged for the benefit of the visiting artists, the Disney group repeatedly saw representations of the papagaio, suggesting that there was a deep affinity between these birds and the cultural identity of Brazil. While in Rio, however, the artists learned that this same papagaio, typically polite and cordial, was also a fixture in racy humor. The parrot, Lee explained, is a fixture of the imagination of most people telling dirty jokes in Brazil. A typical papagaio joke, according to Lee, went like this. Hey, did you hear the one about the papagaio going down the dark alley and he meets a little female papagaio? Despite the spicy overtones, artists still believed the parrot to be an ideal ambassador for Rio, especially as Brazil had the highest number of parrot species for any country in the world. The question now was, how should this parrot, along with his personality, be designed? The answer came from an unusual place. The CIAA had arranged for guides to escort artists throughout Rio, including to zoos where artists such as Frank Thomas and Herb Ryman studied local parrots and attempted to convert their form into the upright, nearly human proportions of a Disney cartoon character. One of the Disney team, Norm Ferguson, once a top animator but now a director, suggested the parrot's personality be based on someone they knew. "Why don't we model this character after the guy who is our host down here?" he said. That is, he proposed that the personality of their guide, Jose Guarana, an outgoing ambassador for Brazilian culture, be the inspiration for the parrot who in the cartoon would be Donald Duck's guide to Rio. "This Brazilian guide fellow," Lee explained, "was a ball. He had a little straw Kelly Derby hat, and he'd get the big open-top Packard, and he'd see to it that we got around the whole place." He even drove the Disney artist through the red light district with its seedy bars and brothels disguised behind pool halls, so they'd understand the entire culture of Rio. But his focus was largely on tourist centers, which he showed them with a deep sense of pride. Because the guide was so Brazilian," Lee added, "so corny yet so engaging and so effusive, that was how the character got developed. In a way, he was Jose Carioca." In other words, the connection between the Disney parrot and their cultural guide while in Rio was so strong that the Disney character eventually shared his first name. Lee and Mary's primary job was to capture local environments and sketches and watercolors, elements that might later inspire background paintings for the South American cartoons. In this, Lee's watercolors, in terms of their colors and realistic representation, remained fairly close to the work he'd done for years with the California scene movement. At times his work in Rio did pick up more expressive colors, but those changes were minimal. Mary, too, began her journey more or less in this vein. An early Mary Blair watercolor of Rio Harbor offered images of the ocean stretching out toward high-rise buildings and then the slate-toned peaks of Sugarloaf Mountain. In this, the colors were those of the natural environment, the shapes with their complex lines, suggesting realistic representation, and the proportional perspective was nearly identical to that of a photograph. The same remained true for other early watercolors produced by Mary. Men gambling in a casino, people moving through a public square, and a woman playing the tambourine. But then her approach to art began to change. In one piece, she presented a village surrounded by cloud-like hills, square sheets arranged for shade in the foreground that gave way to rectangular terracotta roofs in the midground, all of it surrounded by puffy whiffs of plants and trees. In this, she began to play with compositions, inspired by what she saw, but fully divorced from any mimetic presentation that might be captured with a camera. More interestingly, she began to play with color. Likely inspired by colors locals wore, she put pinks on top of pinks, oranges on top of oranges. Color became an imaginative element that she added to an image, a presentation of color not found in a realistic vision of Rio, but colors that suggested the underlying music and mood of the city. To put it simply, at this point in her development, the outline of figures and objects such as people, trees, and buildings were easily identifiable as belonging to a realistic world, but the color she brushed into them was uniquely hers, color pairings designed to evoke mood and emotion. Her work, particularly in the outlines, held strings of figurative realism, but the colors slanted toward surrealism. In this, Mary's paintings bit by bit were taking another step away from those produced by Lee. The changes in Mary's watercolors began small, like tentative experiments, but were refined and deepened over the days she spent in Brazil. In Rio, the group attended a film conference. They went to the Brazilian premiere of Fantasia. They enjoyed a meal with the country's president. They journeyed into the mountain villages. They visited a botanical garden, art museums, a waterfall tucked into the peaks far behind the city. Mary herself spent time talking with children and at times drawing them. At a samba school, the group learned the intricate rhythms and movements of the dance. Many members, including Mary, tried steps with a dance instructor. They jogged on the beach and swam in the water. They painted in the parks, on streets, and in their hotel rooms, which doubled as makeshift studios. They didn't have time to paint or sketch everything, so they took photos that might inspire more paintings after they returned home. Though Walt was the primary spokesperson for the studio, they all attended large parties, including those hosted by the government. Artists appeared on radio programs. On August 25th, at the request of President Vargas' wife, 3 members of the group, Jim Bordero, Norm Ferguson, and Frank Thomas, presented a chalk talk at the Copacabana Palace Theater, where they drew famous Disney characters such as Mickey and Donald, as well as an early version of the Papagayo character that they were just then developing. They rented water bikes and pedaled across the bay. They enjoyed parties with singers and musicians. They met showgirls who worked in nightclubs, and from them, they learned about the lives of average working people in Rio. They listened to recordings of native folk music and saw elaborate live shows at the Copa. They signed contracts to use Brazilian music in their cartoons, including music recorded while in Rio. Every few days, they held informal story meetings to discuss how their experience was reshaping and deepening story ideas started before the trip. In terms of their personal lives, they received notes and letters addressed to their hotel from back home. Many of the male artists, minus Lee and Larry Landsberg, had wives back home who wrote them with updates. From them, they received small bits of news about the strike. They learned that the strike had finally been resolved with the help of the National Labor Relations Board, but there was a caveat. In looking at the future now, Disney understood that they could no longer support the same number of artists that they had employed before the strike when they had produced Pinocchio and Fantasia. In the coming years, they would need a smaller staff. To protect those who went on strike, the labor board insisted that if there were layoffs, an equal number of unionists and loyalists would be let go. The list for those laid off wouldn't be announced until late November. But this announcement had an effect on the extended Blair family. Likely sensing troubled times ahead, Preston Blair, who had sided with the strikers, resigned from Disney on September 12th, while Lee and Mary were still in South America. It would be the last time the 3 Blairs would ever work at the same Hollywood animation studio together. But Preston would mostly land on his feet. The reason he left is now unclear. Perhaps he believed that the studio, despite the agreement, would find ways to dismiss more unionists than loyalists. Perhaps he felt he would be eventually among those let go. It's possible that he simply understood that soon many animators from Disney would be on the job market looking for work, and that it was better to go now than wait for the official layoff list. In the weeks after leaving the Disney studio, he animated a cartoon turkey who appeared for about a minute in Holiday Inn, a live-action Paramount release starring Bing Crosby. But then he settled in as a full-time animator at MGM, where he found a home in the cartoon shorts unit overseen by director Tex Avery. There he would eventually work on some of the best-known and most artistic non-Disney animated cartoons produced during the 1940s. On Monday, September 8th, the majority of the Disney group traveled from Rio to Buenos Aires. Though the accommodations in Rio had not been ideal for focused collaborative work, their accommodations in Buenos Aires would far better support their artistic goals. To start, they would be in one hotel which offered them an open ballroom to use as a makeshift studio. This room was on the top floor, with outdoor access to a garden patio, a ballroom so large that during the peak tourist season of December and January, it was converted into a nightclub. In this room, with tall windows and a hardwood dance floor, the Disney team would temporarily create a working studio. Before leaving California, members of the group had arranged for art supplies, animation paper, and other materials to be shipped there, with the idea that the group might establish a temporary studio. One early plan had been to establish a working studio there for a few months, particularly if the strike continued back home. Even though Disney no longer sought to set up a multi-month studio, the group now had access to drawing boards, additional camera gear, exposure sheets, and even a moviola to check their work. The entire group, including Mary, unloaded the equipment, which largely had been packed with crumpled newspapers in the shipping boxes, and set it up in the ballroom. Even if their plans had now been redrawn to only stay in Argentina for a few weeks, at least during this time, they had most everything they needed to solidify their ideas on paper. They also had a large room with couches, tables, chairs, and even a piano, where they could work together and talk through story concepts for various cartoons. For most artists, they felt a sense of relief in arriving in Buenos Aires, as this makeshift studio space allowed them to fall back into a routine. We just get up in time to have breakfast, story artist Ted Sears explained, and get up to our roof garden studio. The whole gang's there in one big room, sketching, trying to write, and meeting people. Reporters, local artists, celebrities, cameramen, musicians, dancers, singers, and people from the Argentine studios, and everyone trying to get an interpreter to find what the visitors are talking about. At the hotel, the Disney group was visited by experts on Argentine culture, as well as dancers and musicians who demonstrated regional dance and song. Many of the artists with instruction tried a few dance steps, including Walt Disney himself. Most artists sat and sketched the dancers as they performed on their outdoor patio, then took turns on the dance floor. Based on existing photographs, it appears that Mary spent most of her time sitting next to Frank Thomas sketching people on the dance floor. There are also photos of her doing a few turns with Professor Andreas Chazaretta, who oversaw the dance troupe. The Disney group went on field trips, including many to rural areas, largely to observe the world of the gauchos. From the start, the Disney team believed that they could make at least one cartoon, if not a series of cartoons about the gauchos, a type of Argentine cowboy. The group sketched a series of sketches featuring gauchos riding, roping, using the bolas, which were braided leather cords attached to weighted wooden balls used to hunt birds. Before arriving, the Disney group had believed that they would find stronger political resistance in Argentina than they had found in Brazil. But this proved to be unfounded. Not only did a crowd of 2,000 locals enthusiastically greet Walt Disney at the airport, on Tuesday, September 16th, Argentina's president, Roberto Ortiz, whose health was in serious decline, made special effort to meet with Walt Disney in person. Walt Disney was received here yesterday by President Ortiz of Argentina, one reporter offered, who emerged from seclusion of almost a year's duration, occasioned by an illness, to personally welcome the film executive. Likewise, Walt convinced the press, or most of them, that he was genuinely interested in their country's culture, history, people, music, and landscapes. In summing up Disney's trip so far, one reporter noted that local papers had devoted columns, some of them half pages, to Disney. All agreed he's one swell egg, amiable and not easy to ruffle. Disney's manner convinced even the most hard-boiled that he is the best goodwill builder to come down here so far. And from there, the group made other lasting connections, including with professional art organizations. On September 19th, Lee Blair met with the Argentine president of the Society of Watercolorists, Pastelists, and Engravers, largely to discuss an exhibition and exchange of work between Argentina and the United States. At that time, I was president of the California Watercolor Society, Lee said, and on the side was trying to arrange an exchange exhibit in Argentina with the Argentine Watercolor Society. With this, the Disney trip not only had a cinematic component, but one focused on the fine arts and museum presentations. Throughout their travels, for the most part, Mary felt accepted and supported by her male companions. But there were times when Mary and the other female professional, Janet Martin, experienced the sting of cultural sexism while in South America, where they were excluded from some events. The few exclusions were seemingly justified by their South American hosts as being based on a concern for their safety. Tonight, Janet Martin wrote, the group is going out into the country to see the samba as danced by the natives, where the whole dance really originates. However, Mary and I got a blow today when we learned that the thing is strictly stag, as the neighborhood is so awful and dirty, and God knows what all they decided it was, no place for two respectable young American matrons. Other times, Mary and Janet Martin together made decisions to return to the hotel on their own. At one event, they noticed the crowd growing, largely to see Walt Disney at a theater. In a remembrance of this event, Janet Martin, who was precise with her language, called the crowd a mob, suggesting that there were notes of unruliness in the group. You never saw such a mob, Martin wrote. When Walt arrived, there was really a jam. He was closed in on and had to sign hundreds of autographs. John rescued Mrs. Disney and got her inside after Walt spoke on the radio. Originally, the plan had been for Mary and Janet to simply find something to do until the theater presentation was over. But, Janet continued, everybody was horrified because two unescorted women simply don't just find something to do in Buenos Aires after dark. So they bundled us into a cab and sent us directly to the hotel. Later on, they were able to meet up with the larger Disney group, but only after their husbands, Lee and Larry, showed up at the hotel to escort them into the city at night. But beyond instances such as these, which created gender roles of exclusion under the banner of safety, the male artists fully accepted Mary and Janet into their groups, with many male artists going out of their way to notice the dramatic changes that were happening in Mary's watercolors. Animator Frank Thomas observed, Mary Blair, was just breaking into her own style and doing marvelous things. She was great. When she went down to South America, she could draw like anybody else and paint like anybody else, but she wasn't expressing herself. And down there looking at something very like Paul Gauguin trying to find out in Tahiti the real honest roots of a civilization or a people or their beliefs. And I think Mary picked up some of that down there, something very simple and direct and sharply in focus. At this point in their journey, Frank Thomas was almost surely commenting on the way that Mary was using both color pairings and shapes to transform the scenes around her into images that conveyed a deep sense of emotion. Mary herself would put this down to an environmental influence. The fact that Brazil is a very colorful country, Mary said. The jungle colors, and as they say down there, the Black North, has lots of colorful qualities. The costumes and native folk art are really bright and happy. In this, she was finally pushing through many of the semi-realistic aesthetics of the California scene movement to create a style that was uniquely her own. At Chenard, she had been exposed to a set of rules and visual goals that defined artistic value in watercolors. But in South America, she saw something new in the world. Her artistic influences were fairly wide. The primitivism of some South American paintings, the flatness of regional folk art and illustration, the transparent emotions found in the samba and the songs of the gauchos, and an inventive use of color in local fashion. On the surface, her work still held some elements of modern watercolor, but churning inside of it now was something a little darker, more powerful, and at times raw. If her earlier watercolors had been arranged to document the life and troubles around her, her newly acquired approach to painting focused on the expression of emotion and, at times, the personality of the people she painted. In this, she could more directly express muted sorrow, repressed longing, moments of joy, and notes of happiness. This new approach to composition moved her work to a place beyond that which Lee still occupied, into a space where her paintings presented a personal understanding of the world and of the people she met. Even Walt was impressed. Again, as Frank Thomas recalled, the South American art was the first thing Mary did that really captured Walt's attention. She captured the colors and the spirit of those Latin countries. Though Walt was rarely engaged in modern art, especially as it related to character-centered animation, he saw something in Mary's inventive watercolors that he suspected would play well on the screen, even though her role right now was to simply produce concept art that might generally shape the look of cartoons that the studio would later produce. Beyond the art itself, the elevation of Mary's status in the group can be seen from at least one other significant perspective. Back in Rio, for the Chalk Talk at the Palace Theater, the group had put forward three of its best established studio artists: Jim Bordero, who started at the studio in 1938, Frank Thomas, who started in 1934, and Norm Ferguson, who started in 1929. But now, when arranging a Chalk Talk in Buenos Aires, the group rearranged its presenter, still including Thomas and Ferguson, but adding Jack Miller, who started in 1934, and Mary Blair, who hadn't even worked at the studio for 2 full years. She was now on a path to become more visible than other artists at the studio, as Walt understood that there was growing value in her work. Ultimately, Mary wasn't able to appear at this Chalk Talk because of the group's ever-changing travel plans. The larger group, when leaving Buenos Aires, would break into smaller subgroups so that they might visit more countries and regions before returning home. Mary's group, which included Lee, Herb Ryman, and Jack Miller, would leave the day before the scheduled public appearance with the Chalk Talk. But in simply proposing speakers for this event, she had been reshuffled from one of the most junior artists on the trip to someone who might now represent the studio in public presentations. Mary's new 4-member traveling group, typically known as the Blair Party, would move up the western corridor of South America, starting with Bolivia, before briefly touching down in Central America and spending time in Mexico. Other groups would explore the cities of northern Argentina and Chile. The Blair Party left Buenos Aires on Saturday morning, September 20th. Over 2 days, they would take flights that carried them up into dangerous altitudes on their way to La Paz. The high-altitude flight in a plane without regulated air pressure had been one of the reasons the Blair Party had separated from the larger group, as Mrs. Disney feared altitude sickness on the plane, or what locals called sirrash. Mrs. Disney found out you get Sirach if you go up to Bolivia, Lee explained. So she told Walt, and Walt, of course, didn't want to go up there and get sick, so he assigned me and Jack Miller and Herb Ryman and Mary. Once in the plane, the Blair party found each seat was equipped with a small red tube that, after the plane was sufficiently aloft, one could turn on for oxygen. You could inhale the oxygen, Lee explained, because these were not pressurized aircraft cabins. There was absolutely no smoking. We finally got up to 17,500 feet, which was over 3 miles. Around the plane were cities and work areas on the sides of mountains. We flew right along the entrance to some tin mines, Lee explained. You could see into these mines and see the electric lights and guys pushing carts around digging this tin. After landing, the group suffered the effects of altitude sickness for 2 more days, headaches, dizziness, and shortness of breath. Drove down from the airport to La Paz, Mary wrote, all of us suffering from the effects of the extreme altitude. Once they were feeling better, with the help of a guide, they visited colonial sections of town and villages where indigenous people lived, all the while sketching, painting, and taking photos. During this part of the trip, Mary was not only observing local fashions and colors, she was immersing herself in them. As she moved about the region, she was dressed up in a Bolivian outfit, which included a ruffled blouse, a deeply pleated skirt, and a conical straw hat, which narrowed to a perfect woven peak a few inches above her head. Lee, who now sensed that the larger Disney group was reevaluating the pecking order of concept artists, with Mary's star rising and his almost surely falling a little, was happy to be away from Walt and the others. Actually, this was the best part of the trip as far as we were concerned, Lee said. We were by ourselves from then on. Though in regions previously visited, the artist had focused on parrots and horses as possible animals that might represent South America, here the Blair party focused on the llama, particularly how the llama moved along high paths, narrow ridges, and over small bridges. An engaging location for a cartoon featuring a llama they thought might be Lake Titicaca, a wide body of water that separated Bolivia from Peru. They photographed the people, the dwellings, and the balsa boats, and then photographed the lake itself. As Mary recalled, Lee saw the balsa boats coming in, and he said, "I'm going to take a picture of those." In doing so, he stepped out on what looked like land, but was just grass on top of the water. He got the shot, but at a cost. Lee held up his hands and kept the camera up. He was full of mud, and the 3 of us got sticks and scraped the mud off of him. But the photos and the rest of the material would be useful in creating the landscape paintings used in a Donald Duck cartoon about his adventures with the lake with both a balsa boat and a llama. After taking in Lake Titicaca, the 4 artists and the Blair party bought tickets on a steamer for an overnight trip to Peru. Eventually, the 4 members of the Blair party would travel to Ecuador, Panama, Guatemala, and Mexico. But in terms of Mary's art, the interesting developments would happen in and around the Peruvian cities of Cusco and Lima. Once in Cusco, a mountainous city with an elevation of 11,000 feet, the group visited Inca ruins as well as a cathedral over 400 years old. They saw an exhibition of traditional Incan dance, and they explored the local market. There they sketched and painted what they saw. Mary painted a group of women relaxing at the edge of the bazaar. Her watercolor composition was arranged like a scene from an animated film. A group of rounded figures in the foreground, while in the distance the creamy rise of an adobe structure capped with the tan lines of a wooden roof. Mary then found the space to experiment with color largely within the women's clothes. Pinks on oranges, blues on blues, and in the background browns on browns. In another watercolor, likely from the same market, she focused more on the women, covered with serapes and balancing baskets on their heads. In this painting, the women were configured more as a series of shapes, flattened out into outlines that rose up against a river and a hill in the background. In yet another, even more experimental watercolor from roughly the same time, she painted a horse and rider, along with a few cows and llamas grazing in a field. Here again, the people and animals are wholly outlines, colorful shapes that suggest their form, but don't fully define them with complex lines. In the background are mountains. Again, one of the mountains has an ice blue cap rising above a Cambridge blue base. Behind it all is an electric sky, pink on purple laced up with a frothy violet haze. These watercolors were wholly unrecognizable from those she had painted with Lee back in California. In the use of color, the arrangement of shapes, the flatness of the image, and the influence of animation. If she had been initially engaged on this trip to capture semi-realistic landscape images, she was now doing something else. She was capturing the emotional mood of these locations in images that were suggested by her surroundings, but deeply transformed by her imagination. After traveling northwest to the coastal town of Lima, the group visited a school of fine arts, an archaeological museum, and various shopping districts and cathedrals. They painted and sketched in an attempt to capture those details that distinguished Peru from its neighbors. The group spent an evening with ex-Disney engineer Bill McFadden, who now lived in Peru. At Disney, McFadden, as a machinist, had been on the team that built the first multiplane camera. In Peru, he was a service engineer for Pan American Airlines. Once again, while moving through the city, Mary spent time with children, trying to see how they understood their country and culture. At one gathering, captured in photos, many children carried in pets, which were mostly dogs and small goats, as a way of showing her what they most valued. It's now unclear exactly where in Peru she created watercolors of children, but somewhere along her 12-day journey through this country, she brushed out 2 images of children, which finally brought together the many artistic influences that had circled her for months. In one painting, she presented a young girl, maybe 5 years old, in a Peruvian bowler's hat, wrapped in a wool scarf with a doll swaddled on her back. In another, she presented a boy of about the same age, dressed in a serape, who played the quina, the traditional wooden flute of the Andes. In these watercolors, there is the influence of animation. The children here are arranged from shapes, their faces, for example, being near perfect ovals. There is the influence of South American color pairings, both in the garments and in the patterned backgrounds. There is the influence of the California scene movement, particularly the attempt to capture the mood of a culture through painting. There is the influence of illustration, in which both foreground figures and background elements have a flatness to them. And perhaps for the first time in her South American studies, there's the influence of Penelope and the 12 Clocks, a stylistic approach invented by Mary in which a child with wide expressive eyes and a delicate mouth is able to convey the joys of an idealized childhood. This, again, in terms of a stylized figure, is what might be called the Mary Blair child. Though she couldn't have realized it yet, these 2 paintings signaled a new key direction for her art, the focus on children, an emphasis on shapes, and a flatness of presentation. Both children here are dressed in traditional Peruvian costumes, with their faces radiating the open joy of childhood. Though she finished these watercolors in 1941, these figures would be nearly indistinguishable from those she created 22 years later for It's a Small World and other projects for both Disneyland and Disney World. By this point in the trip, Walt was keenly aware of the powerful changes worked into Mary's paintings. After the trip was over, Walt would frame these two watercolors, a rarity for him, and display them at his house. When this happened, many months in the future, it too would signal an elevation of Mary's status at the studio. Also, from the four members of the Blair Group, Walt would, in the early 1950s, display a portrait of his younger daughter created by Herb Ryman. In this way, half of the members of the Blair Party would have art permanently displayed at Walt's house, but as was the case with nearly all Disney artists, Lee never saw his work displayed at the Disney home. Though the social and professional differences between Mary and Lee at this point were still small, the seeds for a larger divergence moving forward were now planted. Mary, using her various experiences from art school to animation studios to cultural experiences in South America, was inventing an idiosyncratic visual grammar that would grow into her own, while Lee tethered himself to the slightly earlier fine arts traditions of watercolors, those complex skills of which he was now a master. From Peru, the Blair Party would travel to Central America and Mexico before flying home to Burbank weeks later on October 22nd. But for Mary, as an artist, the most important aspect of the trip was now complete. She had remade her vision as an artist, a transformation that she likely didn't yet fully understand as it was still new and somewhat raw, a set of skills and a unique vision that would often be used to present the world of children under perfect conditions, a particular use of color, shapes, and figures that the world would eventually understand as the Mary Blair style. But public accolades for her work wouldn't arrive for decades. As for the current moment, Mary Blair was an artist with a developing vision, slowly moving through Latin America on a journey that would eventually return her to the Disney studio. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan right now is to continue our story of Mary Blair next week. We're moving into the sections of her life where she begins to work closely with Walt Disney, and then after next week on the first Sunday in February, the plan is to post up our monthly news and analysis episode. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.